The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Tennyson is one of the most clear-cut conflict poems in the Power and Conflict cluster. Tennyson famously wrote this poem whilst he was the Poet Laureate in 1854, a few weeks after the real Battle of Balaclava, a famous defeat of the British Army during the Crimean War, which is the result of a miscommunicated order to charge the enemy guns. After reading a newspaper article in the Times describing the events of the battle, Tennyson sat and wrote the poem in just one sitting, inspired by the dramatic tale of the tragic, patriotic charge by the noble cavalry. He even used some of the words that the war reporter had originally used, for example, blunder. As Poet Laureate, it was his responsibility to write verse about significant events and to support both the monarchy and the government. This patriotic tone is evident throughout the poem. He does not condemn the people who caused this mistake. Instead, he chooses to commemorate the soldiers and their bravery. So let's make a few notes on the context of the poem. So we know he wrote it in 1854, so that's going to be a good date to remember, if possible. And we know he wrote it about the Crimean War, and in particular the Battle of Balaclava. You can research more about that online, and you can look up famous paintings, and there's also a feature film about that particular battle, which explains the miscommunication and the resulting defeat in a lot more detail. So it'd be good if we also wrote the poem quickly. After reading a newspaper article. And also, really importantly, I'm just going to put this right next to his name, that he was the Poet Laureate, which means he, in the Victorian era, he had to remain patriotic and loyal to the monarchy and the government. So clearly, some of his poems are going to be quite biased. Okay, so let's start moving through the poem, and I will be annotating after each stanza. So at the start of the poem, Tennyson creates a vivid image of the horses charging forwards towards the enemy. The repetition, a technique that he repeats throughout this poem, of half a league, seems to reproduce the galloping rhythm of horses' hooves as they covered a huge distance. A league is nearly 4 miles of this battlefield. Like I said earlier, there are lots of video clips and paintings of this scene which you can look at to help you. The formal and strong use of rhythm is called dactylic dimeter and is used for most of the poem to recreate the sounds of the battle. So that's 1 stressed syllable and then 2 unstressed syllables. So we then get a dramatic moment juxtaposed on the 3rd line with the location of their journey, the ominous metaphor Valley of Death. Tennyson's using a biblical allusion here to Psalm 23, which talks about not being afraid in the valley of the shadow of death. Straight afterwards, we get the mention of the 600 soldiers who are involved in the charge. This number is a repeated motif throughout the poem, forming the last lines of every stanza in some way. This emphasises the shocking statistics involved in this battle. So let's just get some notes down on that stanza. So, half a league, I'm going to highlight that first line there, and I'm just going to make sure I've written down that possibly new bit of terminology, which is the dactylic dimeter, and the idea of it creating the sound of the galloping horses. and we get this immediate action as well. So I'm just going to make a note of that up there. I then talked about the Valley of Death. That's the next thing I'm going to highlight. And the fact that it is a metaphor and biblical allusion. So the idea of not being afraid when faced with death. We get a few lines after that where we get a bit of direct speech, which is clearly the order that they were given, which they then followed out. So forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, which is in inverted commas, so you can tell it's speech. And then, as I was saying, we've got this last line, rode the 600, which is repeated in stanzas 1, 2 and 3. And then in 4, 5 and 6, there's a slightly different version of it. So the 600, we've got this recurring statistic. So we get a sense of the scale of the tragedy. There's a lot more things that you can annotate, but I'm just going to stick with a few in each stanza. Okay, let's look at stanza 2. So stanza 2 starts with a repetition of the order to charge. So the direct speech gives that realistic aspect to the poem. We know that he wrote it from that newspaper article, so it might well be that those were the actual words that the Light Brigade heard. The rhetorical question on line 10, was there a man dismayed, challenges our expectations that men would be scared with that kind of order. But they did not falter, despite being faced with death. The next line, not though the soldiers knew someone had blundered, shows an interesting choice from Tennyson. Instead of condemning army leadership, he chooses the vague pronoun someone to refer to the miscommunication. As poet laureate, he may not have been able to explicitly be critical of the government and the people in charge. And clearly this poem isn't about blaming anyone. Instead, it adopts this commemorative tone at the end. We then get a use of something called anaphora, which is the repetition of the same start of a sentence. So we get theirs, theirs, theirs. And it sums up the expectations of soldiers in all wars. So they can't question or speak out. They just carry out orders and are prepared to die as a result of those orders. We then get the repeated motif of the Valley of Death again, and we're about to head into the battle. So we've got the Road the 600 again. Okay, let's just get some of that down in note form then. So we've got the direct speech again, but I'm not going to highlight that bit. I'm just going to highlight the rhetorical question here. Which challenges the bravery. So did anyone say no? No, they didn't. Other poets maybe might say that that's foolhardy of these soldiers not to have questioned that order, but Tennyson doesn't. So I'm also going to highlight that someone, which was that vague pronoun. So there's no blame. And then there's, and I'm just going to highlight do and die there as well. So we've got this anaphora, it's called. So this sense of duty. There's lots of things that they have to do, and so the list makes it even more simple. That's the expectation. Do and die. It does always remind me a little bit of the poem Dulce Decore Est as well. And at the end, the idea of it being sweet and right to die for your country, and Siegfried is soon questioning that. It doesn't feel like Tennyson's questioning that in any way in this poem. He's just accepting that that is what happens to soldiers. Okay, so let's move on to stanza 3. And again, I'll talk about it and then we'll annotate it. So stanza 3 starts to actually describe the conflict. And again, Tennyson uses that method of anaphora to show how the soldiers are surrounded by the enemy. So we've got cannon, cannon, cannon. The harsh C consonant creates a kind of gun-like violence. He uses lots more sound effects from this point onwards. So we've got onomatopoeia in thundered, and then we've got some sibilants in stormed at with shot and shell. Contrasted with the fact that they are riding boldly, this really starts portraying the soldiers as heroic. Despite all of these difficult circumstances, they are still riding boldly. We then get these two very strong images to describe the impending danger of what's going to be at the end of the valley. So the jaws of death and the mouth of hell. Both of these metaphors represent death as being like a ferocious animal or monster waiting to consume them. So he's creating a binary world here of good and evil. So I'm just going to highlight the cannon, cannon, cannon. And just talk about that violent C sound, consonant sound. Just going to put in brackets. And also, of course, the fact that they are surrounded by sounds and by guns. We've then got the thundered and then the S and the S and the S there. So 2 more sound techniques. So all of these combine together for a very vivid battle description. The average Victorian reader of newspapers and poetry wouldn't have experienced these sounds. So he really is just trying to recreate them for us. We've then got the jaws of death and mouth of hell, which are 2 of the sort of strongest metaphors in this whole poem. And they create this binary good and evil world. But then also we could talk about the jaws and the mouth. Death is waiting to consume them. Okay, so that's stanza 3. Okay, let's move up to stanza 4. Okay, so we've got a continuation of the description of the actions of the Light Brigade, using lots of violence, and active verbs in particular with this one. So we've got lots of flashing swords and the enemy reeling from their strokes. Somewhat romantic imagery, you could argue, makes them seem like medieval knights on a quest almost. So it shows the bravery of the men, especially the idea of showing using swords against guns. So that carries on the description of what they're actually doing, the actions they're taking. And we get the biased view of them beating the Cossack and Russian enemy forces. And at this point, on line 37, we get a change in the tone. So we have a sort of Volta moment, the turning point in the poem. And it reveals the cost of the wild charge and what that has cost the Light Brigade. So the amount of men that came back was not 600. So let's just highlight some of those ideas. So I talked about the flashed, sabering, plunged and reeled. So we've got some really active verbs in here. Shows the violence and bravery again. So really emphasising these bravery, as these brave tactics, using swords against guns. And then, of course, the enemy forces being mentioned by name there as well. So creating the binary opposition of bad, the enemy. And then we've got this turning point, which we definitely need to talk about. I'm actually going to highlight both those words, sorry, but and not, because they're both key to that turning point. So a Volta moment where we get the turning of the tide in this battle, and this realisation. It's a slowing down moment, a pause, realisation of the consequences and the loss of life. Okay, so on to stanza 5. So we see that the British cavalry unit are now completely surrounded. Stanza 5 is incredibly similar to stanza 3, as you might have noticed. So it starts off in the same way, but there are slight alterations all the way through. So we have cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them this time. So if you wanted to highlight those 3 C's again and talk about that again, you can. So we've got the same technique of anaphora being used. This time though, it causes horse and hero to fall, which is quite a sanitised and calm way of representing the horrors of being killed on this battlefield. It seems like an unrealistic idea of how people die. So we have these mirrored phrases and images, the jaws of death and the mouth of hell, but instead we have slightly changed prepositions. So we've got through and back from instead of into. So we've got this highlighting of the fact that the ones who survived are brave, and that's what's kept them alive. So it's a different kind of relationship with death. We also have the left of them, left of 600 as the slightly altered last line of this stanza as well. So let's just highlight, we had horse and hero fell. Hero obviously has a lot of very strong connotations of strength and sacrifice. And then that word fell, so a calm way of dying. I'm just going to put a question mark on that, just an interpretation of that word fell. And then we've got the slightly different through and back from, again to show that some have survived. The tone has most definitely changed from stanza 3 now though, hasn't it? And then we've got being left, physically left, of course. So there were a lot of soldiers wounded during this battle and killed. So we've got a physical, so what's left of them, the remains of them, but also the actual numbers. I think if you look it up, there are about 190 survivors, and the rest were wounded and killed. Okay, so on to the last stanza. So the final stanza is clearly shorter than all of the others. It's only 6 lines long, as opposed to between 8 and 11 lines for the rest of the stanzas. And that seems to imply that this is the conclusion, this is the end, this is what Tennyson would like us to remember about these soldiers and about this battle. So he seems to command us with an imperative, honour the Light Brigade, to remember them and not the mistake that actually led to their death. He only really uses one adjective, noble 600, and that creates this deeply patriotic and biased viewpoint on this particular conflict. Again, possibly due to the fact that he was the poet laureate. So you could talk about this rhetorical question here, but I'm just going to have this line here, honour the charge they made, and then noble at the end there. So we've got the imperative being used when you use the verb at the start of a sentence to make it into a command. So the idea of him commanding the audience to remember. He's not asking us. Something that he thinks is our duty. And then we've got this clearly very biased, again, romantic view maybe of soldiers being noble. I'm just going to put deeply patriotic as the last annotation. Okay, so we haven't annotated absolutely everything, but we have found some of the key bits of language and structure and form that Tennyson uses to portray this particular battle. He uses lots of strong rhythm, repetition, onomatopoeia, other sound effects to recreate this violent battle of Balaclava. And he closes with a call for us all to celebrate and remember the bravery of their actions rather than the futility of war.